Boston's recent growth in population has gone hand in hand with a surge in new housing construction, most notably in areas downtown. That's good for people who can afford the top of the market, but there's also a benefit for affordable housing. That's partly because of a change in the contribution required for developers under changes by Mayor Walsh to the city's inclusionary development policy. To talk about a new report on the policy is the housing policy manager for the Boston Planning and Development Agency, Tim Davis. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We've had something like this going back for some decades in Boston, and the trade-off is if you build big or if you build bigger than zoning normally allows, you have to chip in. So how has the mayor changed that?
Well, the policy, which first was created in 2000 and updated in 2015, requires that a developer doing anything that requires a zoning variance and has 10 units or more does one of three things. Either includes income restricted units on site of the actual property, they contribute to the Inclusionary Development Policy Fund, or they create units off-site in an adjacent area. The 2015 changes, the most dramatic, were both in what was required for off-site or for that off-site payment if they were doing something for the fund.
What about the city's policy on where it wanted to see that affordable or income restricted unit distribution?
Well, we would really like to see the units on site. That's our priority because we think it's important to have mixed income neighborhoods and mixed income buildings, because it is very difficult for our partners over at the Department of Neighborhood Development or the Boston Housing Authority to create affordable housing in downtown neighborhoods. There's few parcels the city owns, the land prices are too high. So this is the one way we can get those units in those neighborhoods to make sure we have mixed income.
Of course, the other thing is you have to worry about these two different kinds of strains on the affordability dollar, because if it's in a pricey market, then that puts a strain. Or on the other hand, if you're trying to meet some very, very severe needs, that also puts a strain. So how do you balance those things?
So when it comes to the money that comes into the fund, that's one of the changes in 2015 was that we asked for more money from the downtown developments, because a downtown development is going to lose more money by keeping the unit on site. So if they do a payment to the fund, we should also see some of that benefit. The money goes to the Department of Neighborhood Development, and they have to look at proposals that are both in downtown neighborhoods and outer neighborhoods, because it is cheaper to build in some of the outer neighborhoods than it is in a downtown neighborhood. So there is a careful balancing act there in terms of creating units in both kinds of neighborhoods.
Well, talk about some of the numbers, because first of all, we've had a lot of new units, even though the mayor's goals seem to be ambitious at first. But what about the affordable units? I mean, compare the past few years to what came before that.
So throughout the life of the program, over 1,700 units have been created on-site or off-site by developers. That are created directly by the developers, and 229 of those, 13%, came online just in 2016. And we also have 746 more units that are currently under construction, and another 600 plus that have been permitted or approved by our agency for the future. Those are just the on-site units and off-site units. The Inclusionary Development Policy Fund has also supported the creation of over 1,000 units across the city that are more deeply affordable, where they've paired those funds with other public subsidies to support more deeply affordable housing.
Flesh that a little bit more, because affordable can mean some things that are very unaffordable for people in some of the neighborhoods faced with displacement, but on the other hand, you've got the other end of the spectrum too. So how does that balance?
So we see this program as very much fitting a niche within a need for the city as a whole. The Boston Housing Authority has public housing, they have housing vouchers, they have other ways that they meet the needs of very, very low income households. The Department of Neighborhood Development creates new affordable housing for both low and moderate income households. And so this program is kind of the program to help support middle income households, because federal and state funds don't support this kind of program. And these are families that make generally $50,000 to $75,000 who are being priced out of both the rental and the sales market otherwise. So to make sure that a middle class can stay in the city, this program is important. And while the city has about 18 to 19% of its units are income restricted, this program to date, even though it's an important program, is only about 1/2% of the city's units.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Tim Davis from the Boston Planning and Development Agency. Tim, put this in perspective, because this is not the 1960s and 1970s anymore in terms of federal money for housing. So talk about how important this pool of money is.
Well, it's very important because before the inclusionary development policy started, so in the late 90s, 78% of the money that the Department of Neighborhood Development gave to affordable housing developers was from federal sources. Only 22% were from local sources. Today, only 26, I think it's 22% are now from federal sources, and 30% are just from the inclusionary development policy. Another 22% are from linkage funds, which are the funds that we get from commercial developers who are paying into the Neighborhood Housing Trust. And we're also using operating money, city money, just to help pay for elderly housing. That's one line item that we have that's new because there's such a dearth of elderly housing out there. We need more.
Of course, the other thing is that when this housing gets produced, and it's not the city building it, you've got a lot of different other players,
Correct.
especially nonprofit developers. What you're also doing with this money is you're tapping into other incentives, tax breaks. Explain how that's important too.
Well, for the on-site units, there's none of that is involved in that. There is no public dollars involved in those projects. And it's all private development. But in the money that's used from the fund, developers may also have low-income housing tax credits, which is a federal tax credit, state tax credits. They may get state funds. They may get other city funds. So because the costs of those units have gone up dramatically over the last 20 years. So just to make those units available costs a considerable amount of public dollars.
Well, the way the program has worked so far is it's triggered by a zoning variance or kind of zoning exemption. In the future, when we by normal zoning allow things to get bigger or more dense, so how are you going to recapture this money?
We're doing two things. One, in the areas where we've done some recent planning efforts, we are actually incorporating a trigger for the inclusionary development policy within some of those zoning changes. But more importantly, over the long term, we need to get the right to do inclusionary development within the zoning. We don't currently have that ability. Other cities and towns do, and so we're going to be seeking approval from the state to allow us to include it in the zoning. So that's no longer the required trigger.
Well, people can see the whole report on the BPDA website, and you've got a catchy name so they can remember.
Yes, our new website is bostonplans.org.